The Israeli Antiquities Authority uncovered the remains of a 1,500-year-old Byzantine church just outside of Jerusalem.
Wow, look at that! Oh, it's just coming to life. That's unbelievable. My brain is exploding right now.
It looks like it was written just a few hours ago.
It really does.
What if the most important words Jesus ever spoke weren't lost to time, but buried beneath it? Not hidden in a vault, not locked behind closed doors in Rome, but sealed beneath layers of Galilean mud, preserved in stone, waiting in silence for over 1,400 years, right in the very land where Jesus walked, taught, and chose his closest men. Archaeologists have just uncovered a 1,500-year-old Byzantine church near the Sea of Galilee, and inside it, a mosaic inscription so perfectly preserved it looks like it was laid yesterday. But it's what the inscription says that has sent shockwaves through biblical scholarship. Because carved in ancient Greek, right there in the floor of this forgotten church, are the exact words Jesus spoke to Peter, words that declare him chief of the apostles, bearer of the keys to the kingdom of heaven, words that certain wings of the church have quietly minimized for centuries. This isn't a theory. This isn't a rumor. This is stone. This is history. And this changes the conversation forever. Before we reveal Jesus's missing words, hit like and subscribe right now. Because trust me, the church doesn't want you finding this. Now, to understand why this inscription is so explosive, you have to understand where it was found. On the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, a team led by Professor Mordecai Aviam and Dr. Stephen Notley has been carefully excavating a site called El Araj. For years, archaeologists suspected this low-lying piece of land, sitting close to the water's edge, held secrets from the earliest days of Christianity. And in 2016, when their spades first struck ancient stone, they had no idea just how right they were. Beneath centuries of sediment and silence, they found the foundations of a Byzantine-era church, a full complex, complete with a bathhouse, guest rooms, and the unmistakable architecture of a pilgrimage site. A place people had once traveled great distances to visit. A place someone had considered sacred enough to build over and protect. But it was the mosaic floor that stopped everyone in their tracks. 3 Greek inscriptions lay embedded in the tiles. 2 were fragmented, worn by time and flood. But the third, the central one, encircled in a beautiful geometric frame of tessellated stone, was virtually untouched. Nearly 15 centuries of history, and the letters were still sharp, the message still whole. And what it said was this: the whole work of paving the diaconia with mosaic was done by the zeal of Constantine, servant of Christ, for the chief of the apostles and holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. St. Peter, intercede for him and his children. Chief of the apostles, holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. These aren't decorative phrases. These aren't poetic flourishes. This is precise theological language, drawn directly from the words of Jesus himself in Matthew 16:19, where he looks at Peter and says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." The words Jesus spoke to Peter, preserved not in a manuscript that could be edited or suppressed, but in stone, in Galilee, in the very region where those words were first uttered. Dr. Craig Evans, one of the world's foremost experts on the historical Jesus, has said this could be the clearest archaeological link to Peter's home ever found. Dr. Notley himself remarked, "It's not just about the mosaic, it's about what it confirms, the church, the town, the people. It's all aligning now. And for that to fully land, we need to talk about where this church was built and why that location changes absolutely everything. Bethsaida, the lost hometown. The town beneath this church is believed to be Bethsaida, one of the most debated locations in all of biblical archaeology. The name itself, in Aramaic, means house of the fishermen. Fitting then that it was the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, three of Jesus' closest apostles, three fishermen from the same village, called from the same waters to follow the same teacher. John 1:44 is direct. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And yet, for all its biblical prominence, Bethsaida vanished. After the Gospels, the town disappears from the historical record. It was cursed by Jesus himself, actually. In one of the more unsettling passages of the New Testament, he declared, "Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago." After that, silence. No more mention, no more record. The earth, quite literally, swallowed it whole. For centuries, pilgrims searched for Bethsaida. Scholars debated. Maps were drawn and redrawn. In the 19th century, researchers pointed to Et Tel, a mound roughly 2 kilometers inland. But the theory never sat right. The distance from the water was too great for a fishing village. The Roman-era evidence was too thin. It just didn't fit. Then came the 1967 Six-Day War, and with it, a reopening of the region to archaeological exploration. Israeli surveys began pointing to a different candidate entirely, El Araj, closer to the shore, richer in ancient material, fragments of pottery, glass, and mosaic, hinting at sustained occupation across many centuries. Interest surged in the early 2000s when Pope John Paul II was flown over the area and presented by the excavation team with a replica of an ancient bronze key found at the site. The symbolism was unmistakable. A key found at the possible home of the man to whom Jesus gave the keys of heaven. By 2016, the formal excavation began in earnest. Within weeks, they had Roman-era coins, first-century tools, clear evidence that people had lived and worked here during the lifetime of Jesus. By 2018, they had the Byzantine church, and then the inscription. And here is where the story stops being just archaeology and starts being something far more personal. Words in stone that were never supposed to survive. Think about what it means for a moment. We live in a world where ancient texts were copied by human hands, and human hands make errors. They omit, they embellish. Sometimes, intentionally or not, they exclude. But you cannot edit stone. You cannot quietly revise a mosaic. You cannot issue a later version of tiles laid into the floor of a church in 5th century Galilee. And what was laid into that floor were the words of Jesus Christ, transmitted through the living memory of early Christians, inscribed in the earth itself, in the land where those words first rang out across the Galilean hills. The inscription calls Peter the chief of the apostles, not an apostle, not one among equals, the chief. The word in Greek is koryphios, and it carries no ambiguity. It means the one at the head, the one in front, the one set apart from the rest. Now, this is where the theological fault line appears. For nearly 2,000 years, one of the most contested questions in Christian history has been this: was Peter unique? Was he given a singular authority by Jesus? Or was he simply first among equals, a representative voice for the collective of apostles? Different traditions have answered that question very differently, and the way they've answered it has shaped churches, sparked schisms, fueled reformations, and divided billions of believers. But here, in this mosaic, laid by Byzantine Christians who lived centuries before many of those divisions hardened, there is no ambiguity, no debate, no hedging. They called Peter the chief. They inscribed the very words Jesus spoke over him, and they built a church on the ground where he had walked as a young fisherman. These are not words the church invented later. These are words that survived in stone, precisely because they couldn't be touched. That's the power of this find. But to understand its full weight, we need to go even deeper into what those specific words actually mean. The keys and what they really represent. Holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. That phrase might sound poetic to modern ears, but to anyone in the ancient world, it was anything but. In the ancient Near East, keys were not simply tools for opening doors. They were symbols of royal delegation. To carry the king's keys was to carry the king's authority. It meant you could open what no one else could open and shut what no one else could shut. It was the highest form of trust a ruler could extend to another person. This imagery appears long before Jesus. In Isaiah 22:22, God speaks of Eliakim and says, "I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." That passage, written 700 years before the birth of Jesus, is widely understood by scholars as a foreshadowing, a preview of the moment when the true king, Jesus himself, would hand that same authority to someone in his name. And in Matthew 16, that moment arrives. Jesus turns to Peter and he gives him the keys, not the other apostles. Peter. Some have pointed to Matthew 18:18, where Jesus extends the power to bind and loose to all the disciples, as evidence that Peter had no special status. And yes, that authority was shared, but the keys were not. That distinction matters enormously, because in the symbolic language of the ancient world, the keys weren't just about access. They were about succession, about stewardship, about who carries the authority when the king is gone. The early Byzantine Christians who laid that mosaic floor understood this perfectly. They weren't speculating. They weren't making a theological argument. They were simply writing down what they believed, what they had inherited, what had been passed on to them through generations of living memory rooted in this very soil. And now that belief, their belief, spoken in the language of stone, has reached us. And the reason this matters so deeply isn't just theological, it's about the reliability of memory itself. The witness, they dismissed. There is a detail in this story that deserves its own moment. In 725 AD, a Bavarian bishop named Willibald made a pilgrimage through the Holy Land. He kept records of his journey, descriptions of the places he visited, the churches he entered, the nights he spent as a guest along the way. At one point, he wrote about arriving at Bethsaida, where he spent the night in a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew. He described a building near the water, with guest facilities, an atmosphere of reverence, and a clear sense that this was a place of significant sacred memory. For centuries, modern scholars treated Willibald's account with deep skepticism. His descriptions were seen as romanticized, devotional retelling, a pious pilgrim embellishing the landscape with meaning it didn't actually hold. His words were filed away as tradition, not testimony. Then the spades went into the ground at El Araj, and what came up matched Willibald's description almost point for point. A church, near the water, guest facilities, dedicated to Peter and Andrew. Everything he wrote, confirmed in stone 1,300 years later. What was dismissed as myth turned out to be memory. What was called pious exaggeration turned out to be eyewitness account. This matters beyond this specific discovery because it raises a much broader question. How many other ancient accounts have we dismissed too quickly? How many voices from the early church, pilgrims and bishops and ordinary believers who walked these roads, were they really just inventing? Or were they remembering? The discovery at El Araj doesn't just confirm a location. It confirms that early Christian memory was more reliable than many modern scholars wanted to believe. And that brings us to the question this whole discovery quietly demands we ask. What the church built and why it matters now. The church at El Araj wasn't built randomly. Nothing in the ancient world was. Early Christians built over places they revered, over places that carried meaning in living memory. The Church of the Nativity stands over the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre rises over the site of his crucifixion and resurrection in Jerusalem. The Church of the Annunciation marks the place in Nazareth where the angel appeared to Mary. These churches weren't chosen by archaeologists after the fact. They were chosen by communities of believers who remembered, who passed stories down from parent to child, from elder to disciple, from generation to generation, until someone finally had the resources to build something permanent over a place that deserved to be permanent. The people who built at El Araj didn't have GPS. They didn't have academic journals or carbon dating. What they had was something arguably more powerful in the ancient world. Unbroken oral tradition. A living chain of memory connecting them directly to men and women who had stood in the presence of Jesus himself. They built over this specific piece of Galilean shoreline because they knew. They knew this was where Peter had come from. They knew this was the soil that had shaped the man who would be called the Rock. And so they laid their mosaic floor over his memory, and they wrote his title into the tiles, in the words of Jesus, for all time. That church waited in the earth for 1,400 years, and now it has spoken. The debate this reframes. Here is what makes this discovery so genuinely unsettling for certain corners of the theological world. The titles given to Peter in this inscription, Chief of the Apostles, Holder of the Keys, these have long been associated with Catholic theology. The idea of Peter's primacy, his unique authority among the 12, has been a central pillar of the Catholic Church's self-understanding for nearly 2 millennia. It has been cited in councils, used to justify the papacy, and defended through generations of theological writing. But critics have always had a ready response, that this interpretation of Matthew 16 is a later Roman construction, a political tool, a claim invented or at least exaggerated by Rome to consolidate power in the medieval church. The mosaic at El Araj doesn't come from Rome. It wasn't written in Latin. It wasn't commissioned by a pope or a council. It was laid in Greek, in Galilee, by Byzantine Christians who lived far from Rome, in a tradition shaped by the Eastern Church, long before the Great Schism tore East and West apart. These people had no interest in bolstering papal authority. They weren't making a political statement. They were simply recording what they believed, what the Christians before them had believed, and what the Christians before them had believed, going all the way back to people who actually knew Peter personally. And what they believed was that Peter was the chief, that he held the keys, that Jesus himself had said so. This doesn't mean the debate is over. No single inscription resolves 2,000 years of theological history. And for Christians outside the Catholic tradition, this discovery need not be a crisis. It can be instead an invitation. an invitation to sit with the question of Peter's role with fresh eyes, less filtered through centuries of institutional rivalry, and more open to what the earliest voices in the faith were actually saying. Because what they were saying is now written in the ground, and the ground does not lie. What began as an excavation on a quiet stretch of northern Israeli shoreline has become something none of the archaeologists fully anticipated when they first turned over that soil in 2016. It became a moment where the physical world and the spiritual world collided, where earth and scripture, stone and faith, memory and history all met in a single mosaic floor, preserved against every odd for 1,400 years. The words Jesus spoke to Peter were not supposed to survive in this form. They had no reason to. The church that housed them flooded repeatedly, was abandoned, was buried under centuries of sediment. And yet, there they are, sharp-edged, complete, defiant of time, chief of the apostles, holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. In a world that often treats ancient faith as mythology and sacred tradition as superstition, this simple inscription stands as something rare and quietly thunderous, a reminder that the early Christians remembered more carefully than we gave them credit for, that the memory they preserved was real, that the words they wrote in stone were not inventions. They were echoes of a voice that spoke on the shores of this very sea, that chose a fisherman and handed him a set of keys and told him that what he locked on earth would be locked in heaven. That voice has been silent for 2,000 years, but the stone still carries it. And now we are the generation that got to hear it again. History and faith have collided. The dust is still settling. And the question left for each of us is not whether this happened. The question is what we do with it now. If this story moved you, or challenged you, or made you think differently, share it. Because these are the conversations that matter. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there is so much more buried beneath the surface, just waiting to be uncovered.